Okay then, so the purpose of this tutorial is to go through looking at the combat bars, which are the non-combat bar and the combat bar itself, as well as looking into different types of decks which can be put together. So that will be looking at the static decks, dynamic decks and hybrid decks. Okay, firstly we'll have a little look at the options surrounding the hotbars themselves. If you press escape and click interface, scroll down a little way, you'll see hotbar as a title. There are various options here. Auto hide hotbar. That basically means whilst you're not doing anything surrounding any glyphs within your hotbar will disappear. If you move, say, your mouse down to the bottom of the screen again, it'll then pop up again. Show hotbar tooltips. If you hover over a glyph, it will show a tooltip of what that glyph does. Personally, I don't like seeing that. I turn it off because I think it interferes with the game. Show utility hotbar in combat. That's basically showing your non-combat bar whilst you're in combat as well. I always have this turned on because there are useful things you can put into that hotbar which you can use in combat, such as potions. Show utility hotbar out of combat. I always have that turned on again. I like to have things like recall scrolls, light spells, that kind of thing, and I like to always be able to access those. Show combat hotbar out of combat. There's no need for this. You don't need to see your combat bar when you're not in combat. I always have that turned off. The last option there, enable housing user interface. I'm not going to go through that in this tutorial, as it hasn't really got anything to do with deck building. It's more to do with property ownership. Okay then, so you can see the non-combat hotbar at the bottom of the screen. It's completely empty, so our next job is to actually populate this with useful things. Things like recall, teleport, potions, as well as things like light spells, buffs for intelligence, strength, dexterity, perhaps sprint or dash. And we do this by simply opening up the inventory or opening up your skill tree, and you just click and drag. You'll notice that there are various glyphs which are greyed out, things like light, intelligence, strength, dash. The reason being is that we haven't actually assigned a deck to our character. This is likely to be a bug because the non-combat bar isn't directly connected to your deck. As soon as you assign a deck, you'll then be able to use those abilities. The next thing we're going to do is create a deck. And the first deck we're going to create is a static deck. So if you press Y, you'll come up with an option, and you want to click New Deck. You'll now have a new screen which will pop up, which is in 3 different portions. The portion to the left is a list of all of the abilities and spells which you've got, and you'll see there's quantities, 0 of 1, 0 of 4, 0 of 2. It will go up to 5, and that depends on how high your skill is in that particular ability. For a static deck, that part isn't important. To the right hand side, you'll see an area which says drop glyphs here to add them to the deck. Once again, for the sake of a static deck, that isn't important. Just above that, you can just rename the deck and call it whatever you like. In this instance, I've called it static. Along the bottom of the screen, you'll see the areas where you can drop the glyphs. Now these correspond to the keys which you'll use, which go from 1 to 0. So all we're going to do now is populate those spaces at the bottom with various glyphs such as heal, douse, fire arrow, searing ray. Just fill them up, and you'll see there's like a little padlock at the bottom indicating that those spells or abilities are locked. That is the key to having a static deck. You have to make sure that everything you put in it is locked. If you don't like the order of them, you can click and drag them into the area which you actually want them to appear. You'll see at the bottom there is a option where you can use current equipment. That basically assigns all of your gear which you're wearing to that deck. So if you were to swap decks later, that gear would follow that particular deck. The reason you might want to do this is you might have certain gear which is set up for specific types of decks. For example, if you've got a deck where you're primarily having water spells, you might want to have more water attunement on the gear which you're wearing, and you'd want to assign that to that particular deck. You can always clear the equipment by clicking Clear Equipment. Once you have finished, click Done, and you're back on the Combat Decks menu, and you'll see Static Deck. Don't forget to click it and make sure it's equipped. To go into combat mode, press Z, and you'll see the combat deck appear above your non-combat bar. It's in exactly the same order you set it up in. You can then click the glyphs with your mouse, or you can press the keys which they're assigned to. A new feature which has come out recently is what they call the heat system, and that is specifically designed around static decks. Each glyph you have technically has a cooldown. What happens with the heat system is it will enable you to cast that spell or use that ability again before the cooldown has finished, but at the expense of taking up more focus. By clicking a spell such as Heal, you'll see it has the immediate casting time, and it has a small portion of the glyph which goes a dark red. That's the heat system. You can actually click it again and you'll cast it again. It'll take up slightly more focus to do so, and that red area expands. And you can keep clicking that and casting it until literally the entire glyph turns red. The more red it is, the more focus points it takes up when you try to cast. Once it's completely red, you can't cast it again until there is an element of cooldown. And that goes for all glyphs. So this system is useful in the sense that you know where everything is. You can cast anything whenever you want, but you just have to be a bit more mindful over your focus costs and managing that part of the system. The next deck we're going to build is a dynamic deck. So once again, if you press Y, create a new deck. Now this time, what we're going to do is we're going to move glyphs from the left hand portion of the screen to the right hand portion of the screen. As you can see, I'm adding healing rays, healing touches, and you'll see just at the bottom you'll see a number which says 7 of 23 glyphs and 16 slugs. Now when you're building a dynamic deck, there's a minimum number of glyphs you have to have within that deck. If you don't fill in that minimum, you get what they call slugs, and I'll just demonstrate what that actually means. Once we've assigned that deck and we go into combat mode, you'll see we'll get some of the glyphs which we've assigned and requested, but we also get these stone glyphs, and we can't do anything with them. You can't click them. They almost become fillers. They're useless. You can get rid of them in a deck by right clicking, but the key part is to make sure we don't get these at all. So to do that, we need to make sure that we fill the deck to the minimum level. So what we'll do now is we'll go back into that deck and we'll fill it up with various other skills and abilities until we meet the minimum requirement of the 23 glyphs. So I'm filling this up with things like Fire Arrow and Searing Ray. And once I've finished, and I've got those magic 23 glyphs, I'll click done. And you'll see when I go back into combat mode, I get these glyphs which randomly appear and disappear on my combat bar. The nice thing about this is you can have multiple abilities which will appear at the same time. The downside to this is you don't necessarily know where everything's going to appear. This means that you've got to pay more attention to what's actually really going on. The other benefit to this is you're not restrained in terms of focus like you are with the heat system. If you've got two glyphs which have appeared at the same time, you can click one after the other, and you're not subject to greater focus cost. You can also combine glyphs, which increases their power slightly and is a bit more efficient in terms of focus cost. You can also combine different spells and abilities to create brand new glyphs and create combos. To try and explain this mechanism a bit better, you can kind of think of it in terms of a card game. For the purposes of this, for demonstration, I've got a deck which contains 3 evasion, 5 heal, 5 fire arrow, 5 searing ray, and 5 lightning. These cards get dealt out randomly into my combat bar. This leaves 1 evasion, 2 heal, 3 fire arrow, 3 searing ray, and 4 lightning left in the deck. The rest of those cards are in my combat bar. If I was to cast a spell such as heal, it would disappear out of my combat bar and then go into cooldown. I will then get dealt another card, and in this case lightning, and you'll see that the deck now has 1 evasion, still has 2 heal, 3 fire arrow, 3 searing ray, and 3 lightning. The reason why it's still only got 2 heal is because that card is in cooldown. It doesn't actually go back into the deck until that cooldown timer has expired. Once it's expired, it'll move back into the deck and can be dealt back out again into the combat bar. If I was to use a skill such as evasion and it disappears out of my bar, that doesn't go into cooldown, that goes straight back into the deck and it can be dealt out immediately again. This is the base of the dynamic deck. The final deck I'm going to show you is a hybrid deck. It's a mixture of a static and a dynamic deck. So we'll press Y, create a new deck, and in this instance I'll just call it hybrid. What I'm going to do is lock down the first 4 glyphs, and these tend to be things which you'd always want to have, so you always know where they are. From glyphs 5 going through to 0, I'll have those random, like a dynamic deck. You'll notice that the number of glyphs required to complete the deck to have no slugs is 19 as opposed to the previous 23. This is because we've actually got some glyphs which are locked down. If we unlock a glyph and remove it, so slot 4 is free, you'll see that the number of glyphs required go back up to 20. If I lock it back down again, it goes back to 19. So what we're now going to do is just fill the deck so we have no more slugs. You'll see when we go into combat, those first 4 glyphs are fixed, and they behave exactly like a static deck. You can keep clicking on them, they'll enter heat. The remaining glyphs, 5 to 0, behave exactly like a dynamic deck. This means you can click them whenever they appear, you can get rid of them by right clicking on them, you can combine them into a slightly more powerful ability. Within a dynamic and a hybrid deck, you can actually specify where you want certain spells or abilities to appear. Now you do this by dragging the speller ability into one of the slots. In this instance, I've dragged Ice Arrow into slots 9 and 0. And what I've then done is I've unlocked them. That basically means that when I go into combat, the only spells and abilities which ever appear in those are the ones I've actually stated. So in this instance, I'll only ever get Ice Arrows in there. You can also add in multiple glyphs. So in this instance, I've changed it so slot 9 only has Ice Arrow, slot 0 will only ever have Ice Arrow and Stone Arrow. You must always be a little bit mindful over setting certain slots to contain certain glyphs. If you don't have enough of those glyphs within your deck, you could well end up with empty slots within your combat bar. This isn't necessarily a good thing, because you're better off to have as many abilities on view at any one time as you can. I hope this tutorial has been useful, and I'll see you next time.